Hey y'all, it's Pete Cussman here with Thank God I'm Queer. I'm really excited today. This is a special friend of mine that I actually work with about every week or so. She is my personal tutor in Greek and Hebrew in biblical terms, and it's really important for me, I think, because as I'm going through my master's in religious studies, and I'm really learning, to me, the fallacies of what we've been told is sacred and what is sacred text and what we're supposed to believe and what is, and to me, actually, what's been really weaponized, especially against the LGBTQIA community. I'm learning the actual truths. And my friend here, Becca Hawkins, she teaches biblical Greek and Hebrew. She privately tutors. She has a master's in biblical language, and she goes far beyond that, because I can ask her the weirdest, most off the way questions about ancient history and like society and things of that nature. And she just like on the spot, she's like, well, it's right here, and then boom, 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 and it's like, wow, it's like I'm having this entire like course in not only biblical Greek and Hebrew, but in history and in societal terms of what things actually meant. So anyway, Becca, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks so much for having me, Pete.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your kind words and everything.
Well, you're just so incredibly knowledgeable. It blows me away every day. And so it's obvious the amount of time and studying that you have done into it. Tell me, how have you been able to, because I know it's been hard for me, how have you been able to, or do you still be able to keep like your joy and your faith maybe in God, or just how are you able to like read some of this stuff and able to parse it out and still be able to touch that essence of the divine? And do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, it took me a long time to get to that place. Yeah, because growing up in evangelical Christianity, conservative evangelical Christianity, I was, I guess, led through the sinner's prayer at a very young age. So my dad came by my bedside, and I was like 6 years old, and he led me through that prayer. And so I grew up all my life kind of like in that culture, and just hearing about how anti-gay a lot of Christians were. And I thought, well, that surely would extend to anti-me, because like even though I wasn't, wouldn't identify as gay, I was, trans, and I just didn't have the word trans yet at that time. That word transgender to describe myself. But yeah, I'm a trans woman, so that means that I was assigned male at birth, but identify as female, and I use she, her pronouns. And so yeah, I grew up as a guy, and that was very difficult for me, because it caused me a lot of stress, internal stress, because there was an incongruence between how identified underneath and how the world saw me. And it was, that was very, very painful and very hard to hide. So originally I would use passages such as like Psalm 139 against myself, sort of like as a cudgel. So like, for those who don't know, Psalm 139, that's a Psalm of David when he's basically it's a prayer in song form, basically telling God that he's thankful that he is fearfully and wonderfully made. And I think a lot of evangelicals know that psalm really well, because it's often a source of comfort to them, but it was not a source of comfort for me. Because for me, it was like, I thought, because I identify as a girl, but God gave me boy parts, and stuff like that. I thought, I'm telling God somehow that he made me wrong, and that I'm not fearfully and wonderfully made if I seek to transition to resolve this, part of me. So that I had to wrestle with throughout my life, and it caused a lot of self-hatred and a lot of moments where I wanted to self-harm. And it wasn't until I got into grad school up in in Regent College in Vancouver, BC, that I thought through this some more. And I was sort of coming to the realization that, like, I thought a while back that if I go away from Eugene, my hometown, Eugene, Oregon, and I moved to Vancouver, BC, which is where my grad school was, that somehow I could leave this behind and it would go away. But you take yourself with you wherever you go. And so I took myself with me. I took this secret part of myself with me. But I realized that it was always part of, like, it was me. This thing was me. It was my innermost being, to use a phrase from Psalm 139. And it was also formed by God. And so that's kind of how I came to understand that my transgenderness is also fearfully and wonderfully made as well.
Yeah. Do you think it was more about, like, maybe the journey of the path that God puts you on, like the obstacles and challenges grew you, because when you start talking about, like, body modifications, and people are like, oh, fearfully wonderfully made. Yeah, but okay, let me look at you. Like, you had your eyes done, you know what I mean? Maybe you had breast implants, or you get your hair done every week, or you get a tattoo. Okay, that's body modification too.
Exactly.
Getting your teeth fixed. Whatever you might have done, it's the same. We're just talking about different parts of the body here. And why are you relegating God to one part of the body, but not another part of the body? Or if you had your appendix taken out, or like me, I had gastric bypass. These different things, it's all the same, right? So maybe it was about God fearfully and wonderfully made you along the path of who you were, of who you had to come through, because you are a different person today because of what the challenges you've obviously championed than you would have been if you had gone the other way, right?
Right. And I feel like I've grown a whole lot more as a person because I was willing to let myself undergo these challenges, and to finally embrace that innermost being that I had tried to suppress for so long. And I just feel a lot healthier and more integrated as a person as a result. And it was very hard to go through life having to having to hide this part of myself and not to be able to show her with to the rest of the world. I just found that it was helpful to come to terms with who I was, and to move forward. And we all grow and we all change. Everybody grows, whether they're trans or whether they're cis. And cisgender, by the way, cis is short for cisgender, just refers to anyone who's not trans. So just for people who might not be aware, but it's sort of like how straight is the opposite of gay. Cisgender is the opposite of transgender. And I ended up coming out to, the first Christian that I ended up coming out to was actually a female pastor of mine. She was a cis woman, cisgender woman, meaning a woman who was assigned female at birth, and she never, experienced any incongruence between how she identified and how she was assigned at birth. She was very compassionate when I first told her. And then I told her while the head pastor of the church, who was his name is Ted, he was away on sabbatical. I had to tell him next when he came back from sabbatical, and that was scarier for me. But he was actually also very compassionate and understanding. He's a very kind person as well. And I remember getting to a point where I was so depressed that I told him, I can't, do this anymore. I'm going to transition. I understand if that means, I can't be part of your church anymore. And he surprised me and said, well, I've never walked with anyone down this path before, but, I'm willing to walk with you on this journey. And that was pretty amazing to hear. And so, yeah, the church, I eventually started coming out to the rest of the church that I was attending. And that was difficult, a lot of hard conversations. Some people understood, some people did not. Some people were, some people started out as accepting, and then other people and then those same people actually ended up changing their minds later and saying, oh, no, actually, I don't accept you anymore. And that was very painful. And
back in home in Eugene, Oregon, or was this in Canada?
This was all in Canada. This was in Vancouver while I was attending grad school, and this was the church I was part of, and it was mostly an Asian Canadian church. And so Asian American, Asian Canadian. I say Asian Canadian because it was up in Canada. But they were I was one of the very few white people in the congregation. And I grew up in, white evangelical megachurches and stuff like that. So attending that church was a great lesson for me in white privilege and these things that I never really had to think about before. And also coming out and transitioning was revelatory for a different reason. And that was because I realized I have lost a lot of privileges now that I once had when society saw me as a guy. And so, because I'm not taken as seriously anymore by a lot of cis hetero white men. And and so that's changed a lot. I also have to carry my keys in a different way than I've been used to carrying them in the past. I have to clutch them and kind of like as though they're claws in my hand at night, just in case, while I'm walking.
Potential way to defend yourself, right?
Right. And it's been interesting and eye-opening, that part of it, just seeing the privileges I've been losing. And it's been an adventure for sure. And I've definitely found that my own relationship with God and my relationship with my faith has also changed significantly. I feel like it's deepened in a lot of ways. And I actually, I've had some experiences where I've felt seen by God. There's a passage in Genesis where Hagar is turned away from Abraham and Sarah because she's not the mother of the promised child, which is Isaac. Her son is Ishmael, and so she's leaving, and she doesn't, she's dejected and worried about what's going to come next. And Yahweh ends up providing for her and her son, and promises that he'll become a great nation. And she eventually, with all of this, she feels seen, and so she calls him Yahweh who sees me. And I kind of felt, there were moments where God saw me in certain ways. Like the two examples that I can think of off the top of my head are two separate occasions where families that I was connected to, their daughters drew pictures of me as a girl before I had even mentioned anything about who I was. And it's like they somehow saw the real me inside me even before I had said anything or transitioned at all or anything. And I felt like that was God saying, I see you, to me. And yeah, and it was very encouraging. And I was just getting ready to come out at that time too, so it was perfect timing. And yeah,
Nice little hint, like you're okay.
yeah, like you'll be okay. And I remember just talking recently with my friend, my former pastor. I was talking with her recently about this whole experience, and she said that when I first told her about it, she felt like there was this tenderness from God that she felt for me,
Mm,
that she felt like God had for me.
mm.
And that was, yeah, that was very healing and impactful,
Oh, that's
just
amazing.
to receive that. And yeah, and it was hard. There's a lot of things that made me angry about evangelicalism, where I came from, and all of that, especially when Donald Trump became president. And I had to come back to the States in 2015 because I had completed my first master's, and I'd graduated with my first master's in 2012. Um, and it was a master's in biblical languages from Regent College in Vancouver, BC. But in 2015, I had to return because I was in the middle of another program that I did not finish, and that was going to be an MDiv in Old Testament. But it was because I came out and transitioned during that time that I didn't end up finishing that, um, and so I came back in 2015 just before my visa was about to expire to the U.S. and started tutoring people here in back in Eugene, Oregon, which is where I am now. And yeah, and just in biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek. And I've had some evangelical students as well. So it's been very interesting. And yeah, and if I only I had known when I came back here in 2015 that Donald Trump would be elected the very next year, I probably would have tried to stay longer. But that too, I think, also made me into the person I am today. Just all those difficult experiences, and I think for queer people in general, I think just the time of Donald Trump was just another moment of the challenge of being queer in America. And yeah, and thankfully that era is now behind us. Hopefully, there's still some. I know that Trumpism now is still with us.
It's definitely brought a lot of things to light, but I think it's about us staying true to who we are. You know, I always fall back on the verse in the Bible where it says that no, I believe I'm bad about the actual quotations, but it's about no man or principality or power, you know, has region over you. So, and we're also not given the spirit of fear. And it's amazing to me how many people I will talk to who go to church regularly and things of that nature will come to me and talk to me about these things of fear. And I'm like, well, you know, we're not given the spirit of fear. So, I mean, who do you think is bigger, God or Donald Trump? I mean, so
right.
you know what I mean? So that's just like, that's what I always think of. So I'm wondering, how is it for you being back in Eugene, Oregon? I imagine that probably your family had, you know, there was some issues there and things, but now you've integrated back into your society. Have you found another church home? How is family and friends and that kind of thing going for you? If you don't mind talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, I can talk about that. Yeah, I haven't found another church home yet. Still looking for that, but since I came back, my relationship with my parents has been sort of like a um, yeah, it's actually improved quite a bit.
Hmm.
But there's always sort of like this um, distance that I feel between me and my dad now. That's hard to bridge because he is a Christian publisher. So
Hmm.
he's like an evangelical Christian publisher within that industry, and has been in that industry since the company he's the president of was founded back in 1974. My grandpa founded that company. It's called Harvest House Publishers, and
Yeah,
yeah, it was
I've heard of
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I think it's more common that people who are from the South, I find that people from the South will know what I'm talking about more than people who are actually here from Eugene. Even though Harvest House is located here.
That's funny.
Because I think Harvest House books tend to sell a whole lot better in the South than they do in the South and the Midwest than they do in Oregon, especially the western part of Oregon. Um, and yeah, it was having grown up in that climate. Yeah, there's a whole lot of pressure. And my grandpa, when he founded Harvest House, it was back in 1974, and I found in some of his memorabilia after he passed away. He passed away in like 2010. He had a signed copy from Anita Bryant, so of one of her books. Yeah, my grandparents were very much like in that scene, and
just
my grandpa was working.
Anita Bryant was a beauty queen who came out against the gay community probably in the 80s. I guess it was early 80s, right?
It was the early 80s. Yeah, I think early 80s, late 70s.
Hit in the face with a pie at somebody at a conference, and she said, well, at least it's a fruit pie or something, like that. And ended up, it's interesting because I always, that part, I think it's in Paul where it talks about the fruits that you can always tell a false prophet by their fruits. And from what I understand, Anita Bryant has not done very well as far as success is concerned. And now I believe her granddaughter has come out as either lesbian or daughter or granddaughter, I believe one or the other.
I think I heard something like that too. Yeah.
Just to put so everybody knows who Anita Bryant is, because we don't know which age level will be listening to this show.
That's true. Yeah, and I only know who she is because I've done because I'm one of the people who would not have been alive when she was very active. But
I'm old, so
you look very young though. So. Yeah, like yeah, it was not that surprising when I found that signed copy in his memorabilia, because when he was working, my grandpa, when he was working at Tyndale House Publishers in Wheaton, Illinois, somewhere in that area in Illinois. I think the city was more specific than that, but when he was working there, he was like the vice president and of that company, and he was very instrumental in acquiring authors like Tim LaHaye and James Dobson, and kind of getting their careers started. And then afterwards, he founded Harvest House. He left Tyndale House, founded Harvest House, and continued the relationship, especially with Tim LaHaye, over the next several years. And then my dad kind of inherited that when he became president of Harvest House in 1991, and continued that legacy. So retained a lot of the same very conservative authors. And
so who will naturally be the protege that gets Harvest House as time goes forward?
Yeah, I don't think any of us kids are interested. I have like a younger brother and a younger sister, and neither of them have shown any interest in taking it over. And he's definitely not going to give it to me. So,
right. And you're starting to publish things on your own, right? You were telling me about this community called Flux. It's a company, a community of freelancers that's really trying to find a platform for people who normally don't get a voice. Tell us about that. That's really exciting. I'm really excited to hear that.
Yeah. So Flux is a recent venture by this guy named Matt Sheffield. He was the one who invited me to the community, and there's also members like Chrissy Stroop. She is a writer who has gained notoriety for her hashtag Empty the Pews. So she is an ex-evangelical trans woman, just like me, except she would identify more as atheist, whereas I would still continue to identify as Christian. But she's also on that platform, and she's written quite a bit. She's already built up quite a bit of a platform for herself, and has done a really good job with that. And she writes a lot about evangelicalism and the ways that evangelicals talk about ex-evangelicals, and how it can often be very dismissive and condescending, and and just not actually hearing us when we tell our stories, and assuming that we don't have very good Bible knowledge. That's another thing that a lot of evangelical leaders in particular will often say about ex-evangelical people.
Which is funny, because it's like I'm realizing how little biblical knowledge most evangelicals have, because from my experience, what I've noticed is that the more you go into the scholarly work of the Bible, you either become an atheist or you become even stronger in your faith. But you strip away all the garbage that's been put on there. You know what I mean? Because it's just, it's interesting to me. I think one of the studies that I want to do is how different principalities, different organizations, different people have altered the word of God in order to really substantiate their own agenda. You can clearly see how they're trying to guide. Even if you look at the four gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can see this progression from one to the next of how they've altered the view of Jesus, and referring, almost had to make him fit this mold of the Messiah that was coming, and that's not present in all of them. It changes, right?
Right.
I'm curious about is because you seem to have such knowledge about Jewish heritage, and yet you label yourself as a Christian. Can you talk to us about your roots are you Jewish, or do you come from a Jewish lineage, or is that just something you feel connected to, or?
Yeah, I'm not actually Jewish myself. I grew up with lots of Jewish friends, and I would always hear interpretations from the evangelical churches that I grew up in that they were so jarring to hear for me, because they would say, the Jews are legalistic, very anti-Semitic things that I don't think they were consciously aware of being anti-Semitic when they said them. So they would say things like, they would equate Judaism with legalism, or they would say, oh, Jesus came to teach, and this is something my dad would say, Jesus came to teach the Jews about grace, and he's just receiving that from other evangelicals. He's, that type of statement from other evangelicals who've taught him, informed him in that. And I just knew there was something very wrong about that, put a really sour taste in my mouth. And it's what made me interested in this thing called the New Perspective on Paul, which there are several scholars who would fall within that school of thought. And it's especially since the 70s, it's something that's gained a lot of traction in New Testament scholarship. And one of the New Perspective on Paul adherents would be N.T. Wright, for example. I don't know if you've heard of N.T. Wright, but he is a biblical scholar, British biblical scholar, he's an Anglican, and he accepts this view of Paul. It's a scholarly view, not really a religious one necessarily, but a scholarly view of Paul that sees him as still identifying as a Jew, or still at least seeing himself as Jewish, in some kind of continuity with his previous his previous self, basically. And so that was sort of starting in the 70s, and it kind of grew and has been very popularized more by people like N.T. Wright, who are very good at speaking to a popular level audience. But N.T. Wright is also not he's also kind of he's homophobic, and he's transphobic as well. So that kind of goes to show how there's, he might have an insight in one area that I find valuable, but then in other areas, maybe not so much.
Right.
And so yeah, I just say that with a grain of salt, for listeners who.
But I have heard that from other scholars, the idea about how Paul was like, these people were Jewish people. That's who they were.
They were
Like,
Jewish
see
people, yeah.
themselves as stopping their Jewishism to start up Christianity. They saw being a follower of Christ as a continuity of their Jewish tradition and heritage. So they very much still
Right.
thought of themselves as Jewish people.
Right.
Yeah, and so but you see, like I was talking about before, this like idea that they're trying to push. You can see this. You can see how we were talking about earlier in our study today about how one particular version of the Bible talks about the Jewish, or however said, the Jews or whatever, were against Jesus. Like, instead of like certain part of the Jewish people, like it was like trying to like lump them all together, like it was Jesus against the Jews, you know what I mean? And like, no.
Right. Yeah. It's from the Gospel of John where people make that leap because they see how often John uses the term hoi Judaioi, meaning the Jews or the Judeans, like, the people of Judea, basically. And he uses it in a very general sense, but he's not using it to set up like one group versus Jesus, because Jesus is part of that group, really. Mm-hmm. It's just as a shorthand, he uses it to refer to a lot of Jesus's opponents in some areas, and others just to say, oh, the people who were there at the time. Maybe in some contexts there are no positive or negative associations with the phrase. It just depends on the context. But yeah, it's just become a more loaded term throughout the centuries. And the way that the Gospel of John has been interpreted has often been very toxic to Jewish communities. And so I guess I just noticed, like, the reason I got interested in the whole like new perspective on Paul and stuff was because I noticed that how my Jewish friends were being treated by evangelicals, and I wanted to I wanted an approach to the Bible where I could actually have not only a more accurate picture of what the Bible is saying, but also to get away from that destructive reading of it where they frame Judaism as legalism. And I don't think that's what Paul was thinking. He wasn't thinking, oh, I'm framing Judaism as legalism. I think he saw himself as in continuity with it. The interesting thing about the new perspective on Paul is I don't think it goes far enough with Paul. Because at one point it still says, oh, well, he once was in Judaism, but then isn't. Like at some point they still do that with Paul. And there are more recent scholars like Mark Nanos and Pamela Eisenbaum and Paula Fredrickson, who are like the Paul within Judaism scholars. And all of the ones that I just mentioned, they're not Christians themselves; they're Jewish scholars, and they just are reclaiming Paul as one of their own. In a way, they're noticing aspects about Paul that actually frame him for his context and like in the first century as a very Jewish figure. So it's still considered a controversial kind of, thing. And it's not something that most churches, I think, are going to accept anytime soon, but you're starting to see a little bit of it among, trickle down into, I don't normally like that term trickle down because it makes me think of trickle down economics, which is not a helpful thing. But like coming from scholarship to some churches, sometimes there's that transfer that happens. So yeah, I think just because I think I knew what it felt like myself to be other within the context of evangelicalism, and so it made me interested in finding ways to read scripture that would not make my friends, my Jewish friends, feel othered by my faith, Yeah,
because the whole premise of the show is empowerment through authenticity. So it's about being who you are and discovering, what truth is for you, and then just like empowering through that, right?
Right. yeah, and just letting, and that's when I also became interested too in letting the Old Testament texts, the texts of the Hebrew Bible, like Christians call those texts, the Old Testament. Jewish people would refer to them, and people like in general academic contexts would refer to them as the Hebrew Bible. And I've just gotten to a point of letting those texts speak for themselves. And not to try to read them through the lens of the New Testament, but just to let them, speak for themselves. And that's what I was very interested in when I started learning Hebrew. Hebrew was the first one I wanted to learn because I felt like Greek was the language that most Christians would go to learn first. And I wanted to learn that eventually as well. But I also wanted to understand the Old Testament very well, the Hebrew Bible.
Because the Hebrew Bible fit the Bible to Jesus.
Right. Yeah. The Hebrew Bible was Jesus's Bible. And so, yeah, it's, I think that's very important. And just letting texts speak for themselves kind of feels to me as a similar ethic to letting people speak for themselves. And not have to be beholden to some other group's idea of what they are. So, and I think that's relevant for queer folks as well as we want to be able to speak for ourselves and share our own stories and not have it be beholden to what someone else wants to like some other grid for understanding us. Like wanting to force us into that grid. I think it's important to let people speak for themselves and define their own experiences. So,
absolutely,
yeah,
I love that. Well, do you have any final thoughts or any words? And of course, I'm going to put all kinds of as many links as you'll let me have down below so people can contact with you. The way I first came in contact with you is through Facebook. So, because I was searching and then boom, there you were. That's the way God works. Ask and you shall receive. But any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Yeah, I would just say, just like if you're a cis person listening to this, or if you're, like a straight person listening to this, I would just ask, like if you have, before you say anything about like your gay friends or your trans friends or just any of your queer friends, to actually get to know people instead of just talking about them. And I think that's what I'd like to see more of, is people actually getting to know others instead of simply talking about them, because they'll learn a whole lot more that way. And because I just remember growing up in evangelicalism, if people would talk about a certain topic, like homosexuality, for example, if they talked about it, it was often when there was the assumption that there were no other gay people or no actual gay people in the room to participate in the conversation. And if there were, there wasn't the sense that they were allowed to participate in the conversation. And I think a way to heal is to actually encourage those conversations and actually listen to the people that are being talked about. And yeah, so that's just what I would encourage people.
Maybe even let them have a conversation while they're talking about them.
Yes.
We might have questions that they can't even think of, in their topics. So
that's right. Yeah, we have insights that that they may not have even thought of. So,
well, Becca, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for participating with me. I'm so excited about our journey together, about where you're helping to take me, and I definitely want to see great things happen for you, and I already see that happening. And so I just really appreciate it, and we will talk to y'all later. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment on this one. Look down below for Becca's links. Hook up with her so that you can learn about the biblical Hebrew and Greek, so that you can understand where the source of our spiritual language comes from here in America. I think that's very important for us all to empower ourselves with that, so that when we are hit with things that we just know are not true, we actually have the spiritual know-how and the spiritual weapons or shield to go back and say, no, not quite like that. Anyway, that's my goal. So thank you, everybody. Like, comment, subscribe, and click down below for Becca's different links. Talk to y'all later. Bye.
Bye.